I remember the smell before I remember the sound. Oil, metal, and rain, the thick breath of Port Moresby's hangars in early March 1943. My wrench slipped from my fingers and clattered on the concrete, and for a second, the echo felt louder than the war itself. In front of me stood something that shouldn't exist. The Army Air Force had not approved it, my commanding officer had not authorized it, and Washington would have court-martialed me on sight if they'd known. But I didn't care. 8 Browning. 50 caliber machine guns stared out from the nose of a B-25 Mitchell bomber, replacing the bombardier's glass dome with raw firepower. I'd built a weapon out of grief, and that made it sacred. They called it illegal. I called it necessary. I knew the B-25 wasn't born to fight this way. It was built for high-altitude bombing, for precision, for order, the kind of war you could plan on paper. But there was nothing orderly about the Pacific. The jungles devoured maps, the sea didn't care for regulations, and the enemy moved like smoke, fast and patient. Somewhere across that ocean, my wife Polly and our 4 children were living or surviving in a camp surrounded by barbed wire and bayonets. Every rule that kept me from striking harder felt like another chain around their throats. It hadn't begun here, among the palms and mud of New Guinea. It had begun on a December morning in 1941 at Nichols Field outside Manila, when the sky turned black with Japanese bombers. I was still Paul Irvin Gunn, then an airline man, the manager of Philippine Airlines, proud of my uniform, proud of the little fleet of beach, 18 seconds that kept islands connected. The war came in a roar of engines and glass. I watched our airfields vanish under fire and smoke, our fighters shattered before they could climb. By nightfall, we knew the Philippines were lost. Within hours, General Louis Brereton commandeered every civilian plane that could still fly. My 4 Beechcraft became Army property, and I became Captain Gunn, an instant officer without a manual, expected to ferry supplies, wounded men, and orders through skies I'd once used for pleasure flights. I was 42 and too old to believe in glory. I just wanted to keep the engines turning. But I had left my heart behind in Manila. Polly Clara Louise, though everyone called her Polly, had stayed with our children in the city. Paul Jr. and Nathan were boys growing fast, both taller than their mother already. Connie and Julie were still young enough to chase each other around the garden. The house on Taft Avenue smelled of her bread and the hibiscus she always kept in vases. I remember thinking I'd be back in a week or 2. I'd flown through storms worse than this. When the Japanese began closing in, the air turned into a trap. Every flight became a prayer, wrapped in noise. I flew reconnaissance, carried wounded men from Bataan, landed on dirt strips that barely deserved the name. Once, over enemy territory, the engine sputtered and failed, and I walked out of the jungle with blood on my shirt and a DFC waiting on the other side. But medals meant nothing when every landing brought the same message. The lines were collapsing, the city was burning, and the Japanese were everywhere. On Christmas Eve 1941, I was ordered to evacuate key personnel to Australia. I had to make a choice: stay and die with my family, or obey orders and leave them behind. I drew all the pay I could, borrowed more from fellow officers, and prayed I could get them out before the enemy reached Manila. They never made it to the airfield. The roads were jammed with refugees and gunfire. I waited until the last minute, watching the horizon for their truck. It never came. The engines started. I remember the heat from the exhaust, the tremor in my hands, and the voice inside that whispered, "If you stay, you'll die here, useless." So, I flew to Australia. I watched the green of Luzon disappear behind clouds and told myself I'd come back for them. Orders were orders, and the war was bigger than one man's heart, but that lie didn't last. By January, they were gone, captured. Word came that Polly and the children had been taken to the University of Santo Tomas, now an internment camp for enemy civilians. I saw her face every night in the glow of the workshop lamps, her voice blended with the hum of generators. Something in me cracked, and what replaced it was harder than steel. From then on, every aircraft I touched became personal. I flew missions not to survive, but to shorten the war by a single day, because one day might mean one less beating for my children. When people later said I'd reinvented air warfare, I knew better. I hadn't been innovating, I'd been grieving. So here I stood 2 years later, looking at a bomber that could never have existed on paper. The B-25's nose was solid metal now, packed with guns meant for fighters. The welds were rough, the paint uneven, but when sunlight caught the barrels, it glinted like teeth. The crewman who'd helped me stood silent, waiting for my judgment. "Looks like murder," one of them muttered. I nodded. That's the idea. It was against every regulation in the manual. But I'd learned something about manuals. They're written for peace. War rewrites its own instructions. And for me, the new rule was simple. If it helps me bring this war to an end, it's right. Somewhere beyond the jungle horizon, a convoy was already moving, full of soldiers who didn't yet know what kind of storm was coming for them. I touched the nose of the bomber, my fingers smudged with grease and faith, and whispered, "Let's see what you can do." The men called me Pappy, now a nickname born of respect and fatigue. They didn't know that every spark from the welder's torch was another heartbeat I'd lit to keep from going cold. In that moment, under the roar of engines, I stopped being an engineer or a pilot. I became something else entirely, a father who had turned love into a weapon. When General George Guinea arrived in Brisbane in July 1942, the air itself seemed weary. Pilots were dying faster than replacements could arrive. Morale was so low that laughter sounded like defiance. The Japanese ruled the skies over New Guinea, and even the officers in clean uniforms smelled of defeat. I had stopped caring about politics. I was still fighting my own private war. Guinea was different. He was older than most 53, with the sharp eyes of a man who saw possibilities where others saw wreckage. When he inspected the bases, he found what I'd built in secret, a line of A-20 Havocs, with their glass noses torn off and 50 caliber guns bristling from the front. The mechanics had been nervous, waiting for the reprimand that would end us. But Guinea didn't shout. He stepped closer, touched the gun barrels with the back of his hand, and smiled like a man seeing sunlight after a storm. "Who did this?" he asked. Someone pointed at me. I wiped my hands on my shirt and waited for the hammer to fall. Instead, he said, "You're the kind of trouble I like." That was the beginning of the partnership that changed the war. He gave me authority instead of punishment, parts instead of paperwork. The job was impossible. Modify every A-20 inches the theater for low-altitude attack, but impossibility was what I understood best. I scavenged guns from wrecked fighters, melted scrap into brackets, and turned hangars into factories that never slept. Sparks fell like orange rain. The air smelled of cordite and burned paint. When fatigue blurred my vision, I thought of Polly behind barbed wire, of my children counting days by the sound of guards' boots. Sleep became irrelevant. The first test flight nearly killed me. The Havoc lifted heavy, nose forward, its guns chewing the air in front of it like a beast unchained. Recoil shook the cockpit until my teeth rattled. When the smoke cleared, the target range below was shredded wood splinters, torn drums, the remains of old fuel barrels scattered across the sand. It worked. For the first time since Manila, something finally worked. Guinea came to the airstrip, hands in his pockets, squinting against the glare. "Think you can do the same to a B-25? He asked. I told him yes before thinking. The Mitchell was bigger, heavier, built for level bombing, not knife-edge attacks. But I could already see the transformation in my head, the solid nose, the harmonized guns, the fire sweeping across the decks of enemy ships. The Pacific was an ocean of targets, waiting for someone reckless enough to reach them. Guinea nodded once and said, "Then get to it, and for God's sake don't die before you finish." I laughed, though it sounded strange coming from me. Death didn't scare me anymore. The idea of the war ending without meaning that frightened me. At night, the workshop became a church of metal and noise. Generators hummed like monks chanting. I marked measurements with chalk on fuselages and drew diagrams on the floor because paper was too scarce. The men followed my madness without question. Maybe they saw what drove me. Maybe they had lost their own reasons and borrowed mine. Sometimes I caught myself talking to the planes as if they could hear me. "You're not meant to be pretty," I'd whisper. "You're meant to end things." Each morning brought a new piece of bad news. Another ship sunk, another squadron lost, but it only hardened my resolve. We were losing because we were fighting politely, by the book, as if war cared about rules. My planes would speak a different language: fire and noise, violence without hesitation. By September 1942, the modified A-22s went into combat for the first time, skimming treetop height over Buna. From the radio came the sound of laughter, disbelief, and gunfire all mixed together. Pilots shouted that the Japanese never saw them coming, that the ground lit up under the streams of .50 caliber fire, that the air itself seemed to burn. When the reports came back, dozens of enemy aircraft destroyed, defenses crushed, I knew we had changed the arithmetic of survival. But it wasn't enough. The A-22s were fierce but short-legged. They couldn't reach the convoys that kept Japan's soldiers fed. To hit those ships, I needed something with longer range, heavier armor, more room for anger. That night, as rain drummed on the tin roof and lightning flashed over the sea, I stared at a grounded B-25 Mitchell and saw what no one else dared imagine. I saw the face of a bomber turned predator, the weapon that would make the ocean itself tremble. I spent nights inside the carcass of a B-25 with only a lantern and the echo of my own thoughts for company. The rain outside came down in sheets, drumming against the corrugated roof of the Townsville hangar, but inside it was the steady pulse of steel that mattered. The bomber loomed above me like a question I had to answer before morning. How much could I change before it stopped being a plane and became something else entirely? The first cut was always the hardest. I ordered the bombardier's glass nose removed. The men hesitated. No one had ever stripped a Mitchell like that before. The sound of shattering plexiglass felt like sacrilege, but when the shards fell to the floor, I saw the space it left behind. An empty cavity, waiting to be filled with anger. We bolted on a solid metal nose, hand-welded, uneven, but strong. Inside it, we mounted 4 Browning, .50 caliber machine guns, each with 500 rounds. The math was intoxicating. 850 rounds per minute, per gun, 3,400 rounds of hate, spilling forward in a 10-second burst. But I wanted more. 2 cheek blisters were added beside the cockpit, each with another gun, and then I fixed the dorsal turret forward so that its twin barrels could join the storm. 8 guns now. 8 voices speaking the only truth the Pacific understood. The mechanics thought I'd gone mad. Maybe I had. Every time I looked at that bomber, I saw my family's faces behind its steel. I remembered Polly's hands, the way she brushed my sleeve before every flight, the way the children waved from the airfield fence. Those memories lived in the hum of the engines, in every bullet I loaded. I wasn't building a weapon for glory. I was building an answer to a question the war had asked and never stopped asking. What would you do to get them back? Test firing the guns was like standing inside a thunderstorm. The recoil slammed through the frame and into my bones. The smell of burned powder filled the cockpit. My ears rang for hours, but I could feel it working an orchestra of controlled violence. When the tracers converged on the test targets and tore them apart, I felt something close to peace. The modifications came with problems. The plane was nose-heavy, unstable on takeoff. We shifted the radio gear and added ballast in the tail, adjusting inch by inch until the weight balanced like a blade on a fingertip. The recoil bent struts, so I reinforced the frame with spare steel ribs scavenged from wrecked aircraft. Ammunition belts overheated, so we rerouted vents and drilled holes where the manuals said we mustn't. Regulations were ghosts by then, useful only to haunt timid men. I harmonized every gun myself. Targets were set on the airstrip, measured distances marked in chalk. I adjusted the mounts, fired, adjusted again. The tracers crossed perfectly at 300 yards, merging into a single, deadly spark. I refused to sign off on any aircraft until it matched that convergence. Perfection isn't luxury, I told the crews. It's survival. By December 1942, we had enough modified B-25 seconds to arm a squadron. Major Ed Larner took command, a man who flew like he was angry at gravity. We practiced attacks on the wrecks off the coast, coming in at 50 feet above the waves. The ocean blurred under us, a mirror of blue and fear. At that height, you could smell the salt spray, feel it sting your eyes as the guns tore the water apart. Every pass felt like diving into the heart of something ancient and furious. When the planes landed, mechanics ran out cheering, faces blackened with oil and wonder. The ground itself seemed to tremble under the returning bombers. I walked among them, touching the cooling metal, listening to the ticking of the engines as they cooled like a heartbeat, slowing after a sprint. We had created a weapon that shouldn't exist, yet there it stood, breathing smoke and sunlight. I knew what we'd built wasn't just for combat. It was an idea made real, that the rules could be rewritten by those willing to pay the price, and I had already paid mine. The day we finished the last plane, I stood in the hangar doorway and watched the sunset stain the horizon, the color of blood diluted with gold. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Japanese ships were moving, ships that carried the same flag, flying over the camp that held my family. I whispered into the wind, "Wait for me," because I was coming. And this time, the ocean wouldn't save them. March 1943 began with a silence that felt like the moment before a storm breaks. Reports whispered through headquarters that a massive Japanese convoy had sailed from Rabaul, bound for Leh, 8 transports heavy with troops and supplies. Intelligence said it was the largest reinforcement Japan had attempted since Pearl Harbor. I listened without blinking. They were sending everything they had, and we had the tools to send it all to the bottom. For 2 days, bad weather shielded them, thick squalls, lightning over the Bismarck Sea. Our reconnaissance planes flew blind. Then, on the morning of March 2nd, the clouds began to shred apart like paper. Through the holes, our spotters finally caught the glint of steel hulls. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, almost 7,000 soldiers. I felt something cold slide down my spine. Every ship out there was a heartbeat that would soon stop. Kenny gathered us in the operations tent. The air reeked of canvas, sweat, and coffee that had boiled too long. Maps lay pinned under wrenches. His voice was calm, measured, the way commanders sound when they already know how history will remember them. "We're going to hit them all," he said. "Find the convoy, attack without mercy, sink everything that floats." No one cheered. We just nodded. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution waiting for coordinates. That night, I walked the flight line alone. The modified B-25 seconds sat under tarps, silent predators with their noses gleaming under moonlight. I ran my hand across the metal, felt the cool ridges of the gun barrels. The mechanics had painted teeth along the sides, sharp grins that made the planes look half alive. I whispered to each one like a priest blessing his parishioners, "You know what to do." At dawn on March 3rd, the air over Papua was impossibly clear. The sea looked calm, a mirror ready to be shattered. From Cape Ward Hunt, 90 Allied aircraft rose into the light, B-17 seconds climbing high, B-25 strafers skimming low, Beaufighters and P-38 seconds weaving between clouds. The engine's roar rolled across the jungle and out over the ocean. It was the sound of every wound we had carried finally coming for payment. I flew in the lead formation, the control stick vibrating under my palm. The convoy appeared below, tiny, glittering dots that grew larger with every heartbeat. I could see the wakes behind them, white scars on blue water. Japanese destroyers spread out in formation, black guns turning toward the sun. Someone over the radio muttered, "There they are." No one answered. The first wave of B-17 seconds went in high. I watched from below as their bombs fell, lazy silver arcs that vanished into the ocean, exploding too far away to matter. But they'd done their job. The Japanese gunners were firing upward, blinded by smoke and panic. Then it was our turn. We came in low, 50 feet above the waves, engines howling. Salt spray streaked the windshield. My heart beat with the rhythm of the engines, 2,000 revolutions per minute of purpose. At 1,000 yards, I pressed the trigger. 8 Brownings screamed in unison. The tracers reached out like red wires drawn taut, stitching across the decks of the lead transport. I saw men scatter, fall, vanish into spray. Anti-aircraft guns fell silent, their crews cut down before they could swing around. The bridge erupted into shards. Smoke poured upward, black as ink on glassy water. My bombardier yelled something I couldn't hear. I released the bombs. They skipped across the sea, 1, 2, then vanished beneath the hull. The world went white. The blast lifted the ship out of the ocean like it had been kicked by God himself. When the light faded, half of it was gone. Everywhere I looked, the same vision played out. B-25 seconds streaking low, bow waves curling from their noses, tracers sweeping decks clean. Ships burned, cracked, and folded into themselves. One transport broke in two like a toy, another vanished under a curtain of fire. The smell of fuel and salt hit even through the cockpit glass. Japanese fighters dove down from above, Zeros twisting like angry bees, but our P-38 seconds met them before they reached us. Through the radio came bursts of static and gunfire, voices shouting, "Splash 1!" The sky filled with smoke trails spiraling into the sea. It lasted less than an hour. 40 minutes of pure destruction. When it was over, the water was burning. Ships lay broken, some sinking, some already gone. Thousands of men clung to debris or didn't move at all. We circled once, silent, before turning home. Back on the ground, the air crews spoke in whispers. No one celebrated. You don't cheer after watching that many souls vanish. Kenny came to me, his face unreadable, and said quietly, "You just rewrote naval warfare." I didn't answer. I was thinking of the camp at Santo Tomas, of Polly and the children perhaps hearing the distant echoes of what had just happened. Maybe the ocean carried the sound to them. Maybe, for a moment, they knew I hadn't stopped fighting. The reports called it a victory. The newspapers called it the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. To me, it was something else, a father's message sent across the water in smoke and fire. I haven't forgotten you. I never will. The news spread faster than the smoke had cleared. In every mess hall from Brisbane to Port Moresby, pilots whispered about the massacre over the Bismarck Sea. 8 transports gone, 4 destroyers lost, thousands of enemy soldiers swallowed by the Pacific. The Japanese called it an act of terror. We called it proof that our ideas worked. Proof that desperation could be genius if you had nothing left to lose. When I read the first after-action reports, my hands shook. Every line described the same pattern: low approach, strafing fire, bombs skipping true, ships splitting apart. It wasn't just the success that unnerved me. It was the precision. Something born from rage had found a terrible order. The men were already calling our planes gunships. I didn't correct them. Kenny came to the hangar 3 days later, his boots tracking mud across the concrete. "Washington's noticed," he said, eyes bright with a thrill of vindication. "They want more. A lot more. More." That word hung heavy in the air. More planes, more guns, more nights in the shop. I was already running on coffee and grief, but I nodded. "I'll give you everything I've got." We turned the workshops into assembly lines. Crews stripped B-25 seconds like surgeons, tearing out bombardier compartments, wiring triggers, rebalancing weight. The sound never stopped the grind of drills, the hiss of welding torches, the bark of engines tested past their limits. I barely slept. My hands were always black with grease, my shirt crusted with salt from sweat. When the factory engineers arrived from North American aviation, they looked at our work like archaeologists uncovering something both primitive and divine. Captain Jack Fox, the company's representative, took notes on everything. He asked for blueprints, for measurements, for testing data, but there were none. My blueprints were in my head, drawn from instinct and need. I showed him how to brace the nose, how to align the guns, how to vent the smoke that poured through the fuselage. He watched in silence, then said, "You realize this isn't engineering, it's art." "Art?" I laughed without humor. "Art doesn't bleed." By mid-1943, North Americans started building my design into factory models. The B-25G rolled off the line with a 75mm cannon in the nose, 4 heavy guns on either side, and armor that gleamed like vengeance. I tested the first one myself. The recoil from the cannon nearly shattered my shoulder, but the shell tore a target ship's bridge in half. For a moment, I thought of Polly again, of how far away she still was, and smiled grimly. I'd turned heartbreak into blueprints. The engineers back in Ohio worried about balance, about safety. They sent polite messages full of numbers and warnings, the kind of language you use when you've never seen men burn in the water. "Center of gravity unstable," they wrote. I sent one reply. "Put the center of gravity in storage for the duration. We have a war to fight." I never knew if they laughed or cursed, but the work continued. Each time a pilot returned from combat, he'd come find me, still smelling of gunpowder and sea salt. "Your monster works," they'd say, and then they'd walk away, faces hollow, knowing what that meant. The B-25 wasn't just a machine anymore, it was a statement. It told the enemy that nowhere was safe, not even the ocean. Kenny promoted me again, made me a major, then sent me to the States to work directly with the factory engineers. America felt too clean. The air was wrong, the food soft, the sky tame. I'd grown used to heat and oil and urgency. In the factories, everything was measured in quotas and deadlines. They talked about innovation pipelines and strategic superiority. I thought about my family still locked behind fences and smiled bitterly. My war had never been strategic. It had been personal from the beginning. Still, I worked. I pushed them to make the next variant the B-25H with a faster firing cannon, a lighter frame, more guns. Always more. We were building thunder now, and the men on the line felt it. Sometimes I'd walk the factory floor, the clanging echo of hammers around me, and close my eyes. I could almost hear the engines over New Guinea again, the low hum before a dive, the rhythm of 8 guns talking in unison. By the end of the year, the modified B-25 seconds had become the standard. Every squadron wanted them. The Japanese called them devil planes. The Pacific called them justice. And yet, even surrounded by success, I couldn't rest. The reports said the war was turning in our favor, but my own battles didn't end at the front. Each night I'd lie awake, wondering if Polly was still alive, if the children had enough food, if the guards had found another reason to punish them. I told myself that every ship sunk was one day closer to home, one chain less around their necks. I was right. I just didn't know how close that truth already was. The news spread faster than the smoke had cleared. In every mess hall from Brisbane to Port Moresby, pilots whispered about the massacre over the Bismarck Sea. 8 transports gone, 4 destroyers lost, thousands of enemy soldiers swallowed by the Pacific. The Japanese called it an act of terror. We called it proof. Proof that our ideas worked. Proof that desperation could be genius if you had nothing left to lose. When I read the first after-action reports, my hands shook. Every line described the same pattern: low approach, strafing fire, bombs skipping true, ships splitting apart. It wasn't just the success that unnerved me, it was the precision. Something born from rage had found a terrible order. The men were already calling our planes gunships. I didn't correct them. Kenny came to the hangar 3 days later, his boots tracking mud across the concrete. "Washington's noticed," he said, eyes bright with the thrill of vindication. "They want more. A lot more. More." That word hung heavy in the air. More planes, more guns, more nights in the shop. I was already running on coffee and grief, but I nodded. "I'll give you everything I've got." We turned the workshops into assembly lines. Crews stripped B-25 seconds like surgeons, tearing out bombardier compartments, wiring triggers, rebalancing weight. The sound never stopped: the grind of drills, the hiss of welding torches, the bark of engines tested past their limits. I barely slept. My hands were always black with grease, my shirt crusted with salt from sweat. When the factory engineers arrived from North American aviation, they looked at our work like archaeologists uncovering something both primitive and divine. Captain Jack Fox, the company's representative, took notes on everything. He asked for blueprints, for measurements, for testing data, but there were none. My blueprints were in my head, drawn from instinct and need. I showed him how to brace the nose, how to align the guns, how to vent the smoke that poured through the fuselage. He watched in silence, then said, "You realize this isn't engineering, it's art." "Art?" I laughed without humor. "Art doesn't bleed." By mid-1943, North American started building my design into factory models. The B-25G rolled off the line with a 75mm cannon in the nose, 4 heavy guns on either side, and armor that gleamed like vengeance. I tested the first one myself. The recoil from the cannon nearly shattered my shoulder, but the shell tore a target ship's bridge in half. For a moment, I thought of Polly again, of how far away she still was, and smiled grimly. I'd turned heartbreak into blueprints. The engineers back in Ohio worried about balance, about safety. They sent polite messages, full of numbers and warnings. The kind of language you use when you've never seen men burn in the water. "Center of gravity unstable," they wrote. I sent one reply. "Put the center of gravity in storage for the duration. We have a war to fight." I never knew if they laughed or cursed, but the work continued. Each time a pilot returned from combat, he'd come find me, still smelling of gunpowder and sea salt. "Your monster works," they'd say, and then they'd walk away, faces hollow, knowing what that meant. The B-25 wasn't just a machine anymore, it was a statement. It told the enemy that nowhere was safe, not even the ocean. Kenny promoted me again, made me a major, then sent me to the States to work directly with the factory engineers. America felt too clean. The air was wrong, the food soft, the sky tame. I'd grown used to heat and oil and urgency. In the factories, everything was measured in quotas and deadlines. They talked about innovation pipelines and strategic superiority. I thought about my family still locked behind fences and smiled bitterly. My war had never been strategic. It had been personal from the beginning. Still, I worked. I pushed them to make the next variant, the B-25H, with a faster-firing cannon, a lighter frame, more guns, always more. We were building thunder now, and the men on the line felt it. Sometimes I'd walk the factory floor, the clanging echo of hammers around me, and close my eyes. I could almost hear the engines over New Guinea again, the low hum before a dive, the rhythm of 8 guns talking in unison. By the end of the year, the modified B-25 seconds had become the standard. Every squadron wanted them. The Japanese called them devil planes. The Pacific called them justice. And yet, even surrounded by success, I couldn't rest. The reports said the war was turning in our favor, but my own battles didn't end at the front. Each night I'd lie awake, wondering if Polly was still alive, if the children had enough food, if the guards had found another reason to punish them. I told myself that every ship sunk was one day closer to home, one chain less around their necks. I was right. I just didn't know how close that truth already was. By 1944, the war had begun to tilt, but I had stopped believing in victory as a promise. To me, it was arithmetic. Every convoy we destroyed shortened the road to my family by inches, not miles. The B-25 seconds were everywhere now, sweeping across the Pacific in snarling waves. Crews called them bats out of hell. The Japanese had another name, the Black Death. I took neither as praise. I heard only confirmation that the machines were doing what I had built them to do. Each week brought back stories, ships, erased in seconds, airfields turned to smoke, soldiers who never even looked up before dying. I should have felt pride. Instead, I felt distance. My life had become a pattern of noise, engines, tools, briefings, and the constant, ghostly hum of guilt. Letters from the Red Cross came sometimes, fragments of another world written in Polly's careful hand. "We are alive. The children are strong. Do not worry." I could picture her writing those words under a guard's watchful eye, hiding fear between the lines. The paper smelled faintly of mildew, but it was the scent of survival. I read those letters until the ink began to fade. The war went on, and I followed it wherever the noise was loudest. In the Philippines campaign, our strafers covered the landings, cutting through resistance like a blade through water. I flew whenever the doctors would let me, older now, my reflexes slower, but still faster than doubt. One night, at Tacloban airfield on Leyte, Japanese bombers came through the darkness. The first explosion lifted the ground under my feet. The second filled the air with burning phosphorus. I remember a flash, then silence, a silence that swallowed sound itself. When I woke, my right arm hung useless. The bones shattered, the flesh burned. The pain was a new language, one I had no desire to learn. They shipped me back to Australia, and for the first time since Manila, I couldn't fly. In the hospital, I dreamt of engines that wouldn't start, of rain on corrugated roofs, of Polly standing behind wire and calling my name. I would wake to the smell of antiseptic instead of oil, to the murmur of nurses instead of propellers. My war was ending in pieces. Then, in February 1945, a message arrived simple, unadorned. Santo Tomas liberated. All internees safe. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I read the line again and again until the letters blurred. After 3 years and 14 days of captivity, my wife and children were free. I imagined them stepping into sunlight, too thin, too pale, but alive. I imagined Polly turning her face upward and thinking she heard engines, maybe mine. When we finally reunited in Australia, the airfield went still as they stepped from the transport. Polly was smaller than I remembered, her hair gray at the edges, her hands trembling as if the air itself weighed too much. The children stood behind her, not children anymore but survivors with eyes that had seen too much. For a long moment we just looked at each other, no words, only recognition. Then she was in my arms, and everything I had held back for 3 years came apart at once. She whispered, "You came back." And I told her, I never stopped. The war still had months left to run, but for me, it ended there not with victory or surrender, but with the simple proof that all the noise, all the blood, had led to this one quiet moment. After the guns went silent, the world felt unreal, as if sound itself had forgotten how to return. The war had ended, but my body still moved like it hadn't, hands reaching for levers that weren't there, ears straining for the growl of engines that now only existed in memory. I tried to sleep, but even in peace, I could hear the echo of .50 caliber fire rolling somewhere over the sea. They called me Colonel now, though the rank felt borrowed. My right arm never fully healed, the shoulder too mangled for flight controls, yet I remained in the service until 1948, tinkering with new aircraft designs, advising on tactics. Men spoke about innovation, about courage. I nodded politely and said nothing. How could I tell them that everything I'd built had come from fear, that every plane that flew low over the Pacific had been carrying my heart in its bomb bay? When they retired me, I went back to the Philippines, the place where everything had broken and begun. The islands were scarred but breathing again. I helped rebuild Philippine Airlines, reconnected the archipelago, one flight at a time. The first time I saw Manila from the cockpit after the war, I felt tears sting my eyes. The city had changed, streets cracked, churches hollow, but the same light fell across the bay. The air still smelled of salt and rain. For the first time in years, my engines were carrying passengers, not bombs. It felt almost like forgiveness. But forgiveness doesn't erase ghosts. It only teaches them where to sit. Sometimes, when turbulence jolted the plane, I'd see flashes of that day over the Bismarck Sea, ships shattering, men falling, the water turning black. I'd grip the yoke with my good hand and whisper, "Hold steady, old man, it's over now." In October 1957, flying a charter through a storm, lightning lit the clouds like artillery. I remember thinking how beautiful it looked, like the sky remembering me. When the wind caught the wing, the world tilted, and I had time for only one thought. I'm still flying. They found the wreckage days later. The news barely made the papers, just another pilot gone. But I was buried back home, at Pensacola, where I had once taught young flyers how to trust the sky. Years passed. The B-25 seconds aged out of service, their metal skins dulled by time. Yet some survived, gleaming at air shows, engines still growling like old lions. Crowds would gather, children covering their ears as the forward guns barked blank rounds for demonstration. The sound rolled through the air, and somewhere, perhaps, a few people felt what the Japanese sailors once did: the shock, the awe, the unstoppable thunder. Historians called me innovative. They said I changed the war. Maybe that's true, but I wasn't chasing innovation. I was chasing my family through a world on fire. Every idea, every weld, every flight came from a single conviction. When you have nothing left to lose, you stop waiting for permission. Today, in museums across the world, those bombers stand quiet, polished, harmless. Yet if you stand close enough, if you listen through the hum of the air conditioning, you might still hear it, the faint metallic heartbeat of a man who refused to surrender. The war taught me one truth worth remembering. Sometimes history is written not by generals or factories, but by grief given purpose. My B-25 seconds never carried vengeance alone. They carried love. Love turned dangerous. Love turned unstoppable. And when they thundered low over the sea, guns blazing, the ocean itself learned to listen.